In this video, I'm going to be doing a practical demonstration of how to do a burrito wrap or a hypothermia wrap. So what I'll do is I'll demonstrate the kinds of equipment that I'll use, lay it all out, get the patient in it and show you exactly how to do it. What's really important is to think about the principles involved with what we're aiming to achieve with this hypothermia wrap, okay? So the reason why that's important is because it means that you can then improvise using what equipment you do have available if you know exactly why you're trying to do certain things. So we need to think about our mechanisms of heat loss, radiation, evaporation, conduction and convection, and then think about how we can manage all four of those to the best of our abilities. We also need to think about, most importantly, environmental conditions. So obviously today is like a nice sunny day, although it is pretty cold, but obviously you might be doing this in a situation where it's raining or it's, snowing or sleety. So you need to think about doing this as efficiently as possible and protecting yourselves and the rest of the team, and importantly, your casualty from the elements. So for example, if you're trying to get out your bits and bobs in order to do your burrito wrap, it might be worth getting the group shelter out and putting that round the casualty in the meantime. Another key message that I want to get across with this is that this is not just the management for hypothermic patients, so patients that are already cold. This is also the management for any patient or any person that's injured themselves or is unwell in a wilderness setting that you're then going to need to transport or evacuate to help, or you're going to have to wait for help to get to you in terms of, rescue facility, for example, or rescue service. So this is for anyone that can't move to keep themselves warm. So you want to stop your casualty from becoming hypothermic, as well as being able to treat a hypothermic with this method. So I've laid out the equipment that I would use for a hypothermia wrap for a casualty, and I'm going to talk through the layers step by step. The reason it's a really good idea to lay it out before you move your casualty onto it is because once your casualty is lying down, it's really, really challenging to then get them into things like a sleeping bag or other things and to sort of wrap them afterwards. So it's really, really helpful and efficient to get everything ready and then only move your casualty once into it. So on our base layer, I've got a tarpaulin, which is literally just a bog standard tarpaulin. You could use anything else that you might have with you, like a group shelter, for example. But what you want is a large piece of waterproof, windproof material, preferably. And then on top of that, I've got my insulation layer, which is just a foam mat. If you've got more than one, I would definitely recommend using them. If you've got anything more substantial, great. If not, if you've got absolutely nothing, no sleeping equipment whatsoever, then you could use some empty rucksacks, for example, to kind of create a mat for the casualty to lie on. And again, that's just to help stop our conductive losses from the ground, or if you carry the casualty, then it stops that heat loss from below. Then on top of that, where the casualty is going to lie, you've got insulation layers. So in this case, a sleeping bag. Again, you could use more than one if you've got them. If you don't have sleeping equipment, but you've got extra clothes in people's kit and in their rucksacks, just get loads and loads of layers of clothing on the person. And then on the very inside, what's going to be touching the casualty is a plastic vapor barrier. Now, some people get a bit confused and think that these should be on the outside. We do have the tarp for the outside, but it's really important that that first layer touching the patient is the vapor barrier. It stops our evaporative losses, or maybe not stops them all, but tries to mitigate that as much as possible, and is a really important source of protection. Now, this is just a cheap kind of survival plastic bag, which I've cut down one side so that our casualty can easily get in. So they're really cheap and effective. But you can get much better products that are on the market that are purposely designed for this, such as a blizzard blanket, which is absolutely excellent, provides a little bit of insulation, and is a really good tool. So if you've got one of those, fantastic. If not though, just improvise with what you've got. Even if it's two sort of bin bags or plastic bags and you have to put one over the feet end and one over the head end, just cut obviously a hole off for the head and arms coming out. And then the most important thing about these is that they're sealed to create that vapor barrier. So once our casualty's inside, we're going to tape up the seam, tape up the side, and potentially even tape it to their clothing as well, so that it's sealed around their top. So that's our layers, and then now I'm going to demonstrate getting our casualty in and doing the actual burrito wrap itself. Okay, so I've now got my casualty inside the sleeping area or the wrapping area. And as I mentioned before, preferably you want to do this in one movement. So I was very lucky my casualty can walk, so he just got himself in. But as you can imagine, if you've got someone who's injured and you're trying to protect their spine, or they're just in such a bad way that they can't mobilise for themselves and you're having to lift them with other people, then preferably you want to only do that once so it's efficient, but also particularly if you're trying to immobilise their spine, the less movement, the better. So we've got our casualty inside the layers. So now we need to make sure that those layers are as efficient as possible. As I mentioned, our first layer is this vapour barrier. So that needs to be totally sealed. But first I'd get my patient nice and comfortable. So I would say probably, Tom, it's best to have your hands up at the top of your chest. Often we find that's the most comfortable, but also if then they need to scratch their nose or anything like that, they can do it and they're not sort of trapped down by their sides. The other thing to think about here is although we're protecting our casualty from the environment by doing this wrap, we're not actually introducing any extra heat at this stage, but we can do if that is available. So if you carry them in your bag or you're part of a formal rescue team, you've probably got extra heat sources, which usually look like big square sort of chemical heat packs, which you can put on the torso. You don't put them directly onto skin, but you'd maybe put that inside a jacket. Or if you're improvising like I would be, then I'd be carrying flasks of hot water or hot tea, and I could fill plastic bottles and you could put them in under the armpits, around the groin, or anywhere you think they're just going to stay put basically. But we like those areas because that's where big vessels are, so it helps get the body warmer quicker. So when our patient's in a comfortable position, we're going to seal, we're going to wrap them in this vapour barrier, make sure it's overlapping. And then, as I said earlier, I would then be getting my tape, which can be gaffer tape or kinesiology tape or whatever tape you've got in your first aid kit, taping the sides together. And then I would also tape it all the way around the top of the casualty's clothing. I won't do that now just for speed. Then you're getting your insulation layer, making sure that's properly zipped up. Okay, that all right, Tom? And I didn't mention this, but because hopefully it's obvious, but I'll just say it anyway. Of course, you want your casualties to be wearing as much of their clothing as possible. Even if they're not cold to start with, they will become cold from being immobile. So get them nicely wrapped up, including a hat and gloves, and then we're doing all of this. So that's our first two layers.
A note on wet clothing. It's difficult to give generalised advice when every situation is different, but generally speaking, if the casualty's got wet clothing on, I would remove the wet outer clothing, add dry clothing, and then place the casualty inside your vapour barrier to protect them against further evaporative heat loss. Don't forget, hypothermic casualties should be handled gently and kept horizontal to avoid precipitating arrhythmias, so just be really careful when removing or adding clothing layers.
And then we want our final layer of the burrito wrap, which is this external wrap. So I'll start from the foot end, folding it in like that. And you want as much coverage as possible. This tarpaulin is absolutely huge, so it's probably a bit overkill. You want to make sure it's as tight as it can be. And then to make it neat and tight, you could curl those edges up, you could tape it if you've got tape, or depending on how you're going to transport your casualty, potentially if you've got a rope with you, we could have put a rope out beforehand as the very first layer, and then that could be tightened to wrap this further. That depends on how you're going to transport your casualty and what equipment you've got available. But this definitely needs to be more sealed than this, taped, or at the very least very much tucked. And again, be careful of the head end. Obviously, we need to make sure it's not too tight around the patient's neck and face, but we also need to be thinking about environmental protection for the head as well. So depending on what material you've got, sometimes you can curl these up. And say if you're in a forested area or somewhere where there's sticks, you can sometimes put a stick into here, roll it in place, and that'll act as a bit of a splint to kind of keep that up as a little layer of protection. Just always remember that you shouldn't be covering the casualty's face. You always want to be able to see and access them and hear them, and they need to be able to communicate with you if they can.